The early morning light barely pierced through the curtains of the briefing room as I stood before the case file, its edges frayed from constant handling. The name on the cover reads Stevie Lynn Allison Osborne, a 2-year-old child whose life had ended far too soon. Her photo, clipped to the first page, showed a smiling little girl with bright eyes, strawberry blonde hair, and a joy that seemed to radiate from the image itself. It was hard to reconcile that vibrant image with the bruised and lifeless body found days earlier. The first 911 call had come from a man named Joseph Chilson, the boyfriend of Stevie's mother, Abigail. He claimed the child had fallen from her bed and was unresponsive. His voice had been shaky, and the details he provided were vague at best. Responders had been dispatched to the Wild Oak apartment homes on North Flintlock Road, where the child was reportedly in distress. The paramedics' accounts were the first indication that this case was more than an accident. When officers arrived on the scene, they found Stevie lying in the living room. Her small frame was covered in bruises, some old and faded, others fresh and glaring. She wasn't breathing, and paramedics noted signs of cardiac arrest. They worked furiously to revive her, but the injuries were extensive. The child was rushed to Liberty Hospital before being transferred to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City. It was there that the attending neurosurgeon delivered the grim prognosis: the injuries were not accidental. Blunt force trauma to her skull had caused irreparable damage, and the signs pointed to an intentional act of violence. I had reviewed the paramedics' notes. They had been struck by the bruises not just on her head but scattered across her arms, legs, abdomen, and even her neck. One medic described the sight as gut-wrenching. There were questions about why no one had sought medical attention earlier, especially given that Stevie's mother, Abigail, worked as a critical care nurse. The inconsistency in the stories began to stand out. Interviews with Abigail painted a troubling picture. She admitted that Stevie had been unwell in the days leading up to the incident. On December 21st, during a family Christmas party, relatives had noticed that Stevie was lethargic, vomiting repeatedly, and had visible bruises. Abigail had brushed off their concerns, attributing the symptoms to a stomach bug and normal childhood clumsiness. Her nonchalant attitude was unsettling, especially for someone with medical training. Joseph's account was equally suspect. He claimed Stevie had tripped over the family dog and hit her head on a tile floor, causing the bruises on her forehead. However, family members at the party had noted that Joseph was unusually possessive of the child, insisting on changing her clothes each time she vomited. No one else had been allowed near her. It was a detail that would gnaw at me as I pieced together the events of that weekend. The turning point came on December 23rd, the day Stevie was brought to the hospital. Joseph had called Abigail again, this time saying Stevie had fallen out of bed and was unresponsive. The timeline was vague, but Abigail's decision to call 911 only after returning home raised immediate red flags. Why hadn't Joseph called for help earlier? Why did he call Abigail instead? At the hospital, Gary Osborne, Stevie's father, arrived in a state of panic. His frustration at not being able to see his daughter led to a confrontation with hospital staff, and officers were called in to calm the situation. It didn't take long to understand Gary's reaction. As I reviewed the footage from the hospital's security cameras, I saw a man consumed by fear and heartbreak, desperate to know if his little girl was still alive. The neurosurgeon's report was as clear as it was devastating. Stevie's skull had multiple fractures, her brain showed signs of swelling and hemorrhaging, and her body bore the hallmarks of prolonged abuse. A child her size couldn't sustain such injuries without significant force. The doctor's words haunted me. This was not an accident. The evidence demanded immediate action. Abigail and Joseph were brought in for questioning. Abigail seemed detached, her responses measured and clinical. She admitted to seeing bruises on Stevie during the Christmas party, but claimed they were minor. She recounted the vomiting and lethargy, but maintained that she thought Stevie was simply ill. "I gave her Dramamine," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "I thought it would help." Joseph's demeanor was more erratic. He spoke of arguments with Abigail, one of which had allegedly turned physical, with him pulling her hair while she held Stevie in her arms. He described Stevie as clumsy and admitted to being present during several of her injuries. But when pressed on the specifics, his story began to unravel. He repeatedly contradicted himself, first blaming the family dog, then suggesting that the injuries could have happened when Stevie fell from her bed. The deflections only deepened my suspicion. The autopsy report solidified what we already suspected. Dr. Alaf Hossein, the chief medical examiner, detailed a litany of injuries, contusions on her forehead, scalp, abdomen, and legs, as well as signs of internal hemorrhaging. The cause of death was unequivocal homicide by blunt force trauma. As I left the office that evening, the weight of the case pressed heavily on my shoulders. Stevie's bright smile from the photo on her file was a stark contrast to the cold, clinical details of her death. Someone had stolen her innocence, her joy, and her future. My job was to ensure that whoever was responsible faced the full weight of justice. The interviews with Abigail and Joseph were like stepping into a labyrinth of deceit, each turn twisting further away from the truth. While Abigail remained disturbingly calm, Joseph's defensiveness painted a clearer picture of a man who knew he was running out of places to hide. The first inconsistency came from Abigail's recounting of the events leading up to Stevie's hospitalization. She admitted that Stevie had been vomiting and lethargic for 2 days prior, but claimed she believed it was nothing more than a passing illness. "I didn't think it was serious," she said, her voice detached. "Kids get sick all the time." Yet, this excuse didn't align with the photographic evidence from the Christmas party. Bruises were clearly visible on Stevie's forehead and ears. Relatives reported that the little girl barely moved, let alone played, during the gathering. When questioned about this, Abigail's responses became vaguer, and she seemed eager to shift the focus to Joseph. Joseph's testimony was a maze of contradictions. He admitted that Stevie had fallen and hit her head on the tile floor, which he claimed caused the initial bruise on her forehead. However, the injuries were far more severe than a simple fall could explain. When asked about the other bruises on her body, he hesitated, then deflected. "She's a clumsy kid," he muttered. "She trips over everything." I pressed him further. "What about the vomiting? The signs of head trauma?" "She's always been like that," Joseph snapped, his tone sharpening. "You'd have to ask Abigail. She's the nurse." It was clear he was attempting to distance himself from responsibility, but his control began to slip when confronted with reports of his temper. Abigail had reluctantly admitted during her interview that Joseph had anger issues. She described incidents where he punched walls and threw objects, including one occasion where he'd yanked her hair and thrown her onto a bed while she was holding Stevie. When asked why she continued to leave Stevie in Joseph's care despite these episodes, Abigail's response was chilling. "I didn't think he'd hurt her." The narrative unraveled further when I reviewed statements from the party attendees. Stevie's maternal great-grandmother, Carol, had taken photos during the Christmas party. The images showed Stevie sitting listlessly on Abigail's lap, her face pale, her forehead marked by dark bruises. Carol's caption was innocent enough, a grandmother's attempt to document a family gathering, but the visual evidence was damning. Several family members had expressed concern about Stevie's condition during the party. They recalled Abigail brushing off their worries with dismissive comments like, "She's just tired," or "It's nothing serious." One detail stood out in every account: Joseph's possessiveness. Every time Stevie vomited, he insisted on being the one to change her clothes. No one else was allowed near her. This raised immediate red flags. Why would he be so adamant about controlling who interacted with her? Was it guilt? Or was he trying to hide something? The most damning evidence came during Joseph's second interview. When confronted with the autopsy findings, multiple skull fractures, signs of internal hemorrhaging, and bruising consistent with forceful trauma, his demeanor shifted. He became defensive, his voice rising with every question. "I didn't do anything to her," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "It was an accident." But accidents didn't explain the sheer brutality of Stevie's injuries. When I mentioned the argument he had with Abigail the day before Stevie's death, he froze. His eyes darted toward the door, as if searching for an escape. "That's not what happened," he stammered. "I didn't mean for it to get physical." She started yelling at me about Stevie, about the bruises. I lost my temper, okay? But I didn't touch the kid. His outburst was telling. He'd admitted to losing control, to letting his anger dictate his actions. But was he admitting to something more? The evidence against Joseph mounted, but questions about Abigail's role lingered. As a critical care nurse, she should have recognized the severity of Stevie's symptoms. A head injury accompanied by repeated vomiting is a glaring sign of a concussion or worse. Yet, Abigail had chosen to treat Stevie's symptoms with Dramamine and Sprite rather than seek medical attention. This negligence was difficult to reconcile with her professional background. The final piece of the puzzle came from Stevie's medical records, obtained during the investigation. They showed a pattern of injuries dating back months, bruises, minor fractures, and unexplained illnesses. Each incident had been brushed off as an accident or typical childhood mishaps. But the cumulative picture was clear: this was a child who had suffered repeatedly, and no one had intervened. When presented with these findings, Abigail's composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, but they felt rehearsed, calculated. "I didn't know it was this bad," she whispered. "I trusted Joseph. I thought he was good with her." It was hard to believe. A mother, a nurse, someone trained to recognize the signs of trauma, had failed her child in the most fundamental way. Whether it was negligence, denial, or complicity, Abigail's inaction had contributed to Stevie's suffering. As the interviews concluded, the weight of the evidence settled heavily. Joseph's temper and Abigail's indifference had created a perfect storm of neglect and abuse. Stevie had no chance against the adults who were supposed to protect her. It was my job to ensure their failures didn't go unanswered. The day Stevie was admitted to the hospital was a turning point, not just in the investigation, but in my understanding of the depths of human pain. As an investigator, you learn to compartmentalize, to treat facts as pieces of a puzzle. But nothing prepared me for the reality of standing over the small, lifeless body of a 2-year-old girl, whose last moments were a testament to unimaginable suffering. Stevie arrived at the emergency room in cardiac arrest. The paramedics reported visible bruising on her forehead, neck, and abdomen. Her tiny body bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged abuse. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but the damage was extensive. Skull fractures, internal bleeding, and brain swelling pointed to more than an accidental fall. Gary Osborne, Stevie's father, arrived at the hospital shortly after. His desperation was palpable. He burst through the doors demanding answers, his voice breaking as he asked to see his daughter. Hospital staff initially held him back, concerned about his state of mind, but eventually allowed him to sit beside her. Watching him cradle her small hand, whispering reassurances she couldn't hear, was gut-wrenching. I could see the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that medical science couldn't sustain. The attending neurosurgeon delivered the devastating news bluntly: Stevie's injuries were not survivable. Her brain was no longer communicating with her body. Life-saving measures were futile. Gary's reaction was a mix of shock and denial, an anguished refusal to accept the reality before him. Abigail, on the other hand, sat stiffly in a chair, her face a mask of indifference. She picked up her phone and made a call, her voice eerily detached as she told her mother, "You can tell everyone to go home. She's dead." I watched Gary as he glanced at her, disbelief and fury etched across his face. The hospital chaplain approached to offer comfort, but Gary barely noticed. His entire focus was on Stevie, as though his sheer willpower might bring her back. When the doctors informed him that her injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, his composure finally shattered. He screamed, demanding to know who had done this to his little girl. The autopsy report was nothing short of harrowing. It detailed extensive injuries that spoke to repeated violence. Hemorrhages beneath the scalp, abdominal trauma, and bruises on her inner thighs and chest painted a horrifying picture. This wasn't the result of a single incident, but the culmination of sustained abuse. The medical examiner's conclusion was unequivocal: homicide by blunt force trauma. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the emotional toll on Stevie's family was incalculable. Gary's grief was compounded by guilt for trusting Abigail, for not recognizing the signs, for not being there when Stevie needed him most. His mother, Valerie, clung to him, tears streaming down her face as she tried to offer comfort. But no words could fill the void left by Stevie's death. At the same time, Abigail's behavior raised more questions than answers. Her stoic demeanor, her lack of urgency in seeking medical attention, and her decision to leave Stevie in Joseph's care, despite his known temper, were deeply troubling. Family members described her as emotionally distant, someone who often deflected responsibility. But even they were shocked by her apparent indifference in the wake of Stevie's death. The investigation delved into Abigail's actions or lack thereof in the days leading up to the tragedy. Family members at the Christmas party had expressed concerns about Stevie's condition, but Abigail dismissed them, attributing the bruises and vomiting to childhood clumsiness. Her choice to prioritize convenience over Stevie's well-being was a glaring failure, one that couldn't be ignored. As for Joseph, his role in Stevie's death became increasingly clear. His temper, his control over who could interact with Stevie, and his attempts to deflect blame painted the portrait of an abuser desperate to hide his guilt. When he learned that a warrant had been issued for his arrest, he made the ultimate admission. He took his own life, leaving behind a note that stopped short of confessing but spoke volumes about his state of mind. Stevie's funeral was a somber affair. Gary made the difficult decision to allow Abigail to attend, despite his family's protests. He didn't want to deprive his daughter of the semblance of a family, even in death. Abigail's eulogy was filled with platitudes about love and forgiveness, but to those who knew the truth, her words rang hollow. Gary stood silently by her grave, a pink casket surrounded by flowers, as he vowed to fight for justice in Stevie's name. The community's response was one of collective outrage. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers expressed their grief and anger over Stevie's death. A small memorial was erected outside the apartment complex where she had lived, a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence and the failure of those entrusted to protect it. For me, this case became personal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Stevie's bright smile and boundless curiosity were captured in photographs that haunted my desk, a constant reminder of why I had chosen this path. Her story wasn't just about a life lost, but about the systemic failures that allowed her suffering to go unnoticed for so long. I promised myself that her voice would not be silenced, even if justice seemed elusive. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the evidence continued to mount. Every photograph, every statement, every piece of medical testimony painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of what Stevie endured. The question that remained was whether the legal system would hold those responsible to account or let Stevie's story fade into another statistic. I wasn't willing to let that happen. The quest for justice for Stevie Osborne was riddled with frustrations, heartbreak, and systemic failures. Investigators and prosecutors faced overwhelming evidence, yet the outcome left her family, especially her father Gary, feeling abandoned by the justice system. Abigail's neglect and indifference as a mother were undeniable. Despite her medical background as a critical care nurse, she ignored clear signs of severe trauma, bruises, vomiting, and lethargy that screamed for urgent medical attention. Witnesses at the Christmas party raised concerns, yet she dismissed them, attributing Stevie's condition to clumsiness or illness. Most damningly, she left her vulnerable daughter with her volatile boyfriend, Joseph Chilson, despite knowing his violent tendencies. When Joseph became the primary suspect, the case took an unexpected turn. Faced with an arrest warrant, Joseph took his own life, leaving investigators with unresolved questions. His suicide was viewed by authorities as an admission of guilt, effectively closing the criminal investigation against Abigail. For Gary, however, this felt like a hollow resolution. Joseph's death didn't absolve Abigail's negligence, and her role in enabling the abuse remained unpunished. Court proceedings offered little solace. Medical testimony revealed the horrific extent of Stevie's injuries, skull fractures, internal bleeding, and bruising that could only result from severe trauma. The evidence pointed to intentional harm, and while Joseph's role as the abuser was clear, Abigail's failure to protect her daughter was equally damning. Yet prosecutors refused to bring charges against her, citing the absence of direct evidence linking her to Stevie's injuries. Instead, they dismissed her actions as bad parenting, a conclusion that left Gary shattered. The Children's Division report added to the weight of the tragedy. Multiple hotline calls about Stevie's welfare had gone unheeded, exposing a systemic failure to protect her. The agency's findings of negligence resulted in Abigail being added to the Central Registry of Child Abuse and Neglect. But this administrative action felt grossly inadequate. For Gary, the lack of accountability was unbearable. He worked tirelessly to advocate for his daughter, but his efforts were met with bureaucratic apathy. When he confronted the prosecutor, he was told, "It's not illegal to be a bad mom." These words, cutting and indifferent, symbolized a system more concerned with technicalities than justice. In the aftermath, Gary sought to honor Stevie's memory. He created a memorial in her room and launched a campaign to raise awareness about child abuse and systemic shortcomings. Yet, his fight for accountability remains a painful reminder of the gaps in a system that failed his daughter. For Stevie's family, the struggle continues not just for justice, but to ensure her story serves as a call to protect vulnerable children from similar tragedies. Stevie Lynn Osborne's tragic story ended with heartbreak, but for her father, Gary, it marked the beginning of an unrelenting journey for justice and the preservation of his daughter's memory. The justice system might have failed to hold everyone accountable for her death, but Gary vowed to ensure Stevie would not be forgotten. Her funeral, held on December 28, 2019, was a bittersweet farewell. Friends, family, and Gary's co-workers came together to celebrate the life of a vibrant little girl whose light had been extinguished far too soon. The funeral was funded by Gary's Workplace Trauma Fund, a gesture that highlighted the support and solidarity from those around him. Despite Gary's reservations, he allowed Abigail to attend, wanting to believe in her innocence for Stevie's sake. However, the burial turned into another painful chapter in the saga. Abigail, without informing Gary or his family, arranged for the burial to take place privately. Gary and his loved ones were left out, unable to say a final goodbye as Stevie was laid to rest in her pink casket at Whitechapel Cemetery. For Gary, these actions epitomized the systemic failure that marked his experience from the moment he sought justice for Stevie. The authorities deemed Joseph Chilson's death and his alleged involvement as the conclusion of the case, effectively closing the door on further investigations. But for Gary, the case was far from over. He felt strongly that Abigail's negligence, as a mother and a trained medical professional, played a significant role in Stevie's suffering and death. She had seen the signs and failed to act, leaving Stevie vulnerable in an environment that ultimately claimed her life. Gary channeled his grief into advocacy, seeking answers and accountability not just for Stevie but for other children who might face similar circumstances. To honor Stevie's memory, Gary created a memorial in her room, filled with her favorite stuffed animals, including the sloths she loved so much. He also had teddy bears made from her clothing, small keepsakes of her presence that he and his family held onto dearly. But his efforts did not stop there. Gary launched a GoFundMe campaign to fund two goals: legal representation to continue seeking justice for Stevie and a lasting memorial for her. The campaign's vision was clear: Stevie's resting place should reflect the bright and joyful spirit she embodied in life. It aimed to create a space where loved ones could gather, share memories, and honor the child who had brought so much happiness to those around her. The campaign also sought to highlight the systemic failures that allowed Stevie to slip through the cracks. Gary worked tirelessly to bring attention to her story, hoping it would serve as a cautionary tale and a call to action for reforms in child welfare systems. While local media provided minimal coverage of Stevie's case, Gary took to social media and online platforms to keep her memory alive. Partnering with advocates and true crime storytellers, he shared her story widely, ensuring her voice would not be silenced by the bureaucracy and indifference he had encountered. Stevie's headstone became a symbolic battle for Gary, a testament to his determination to ensure her memory was honored in the way she deserved. He envisioned a vibrant tribute, free from any association with the pain and tragedy that had surrounded her passing. Alongside the headstone, he also hoped to establish a memorial bench at English Landing Park in Parkville, Missouri, a place where others could sit and reflect on the preciousness of life. Gary's fight for justice was not just about seeking punishment, but about changing a system that had failed to protect his daughter. He often spoke about the love and joy Stevie brought into his life and the deep void her absence had left. He hoped that by sharing her story, he could inspire change and ensure that no other family would have to endure the pain he had experienced. Stevie's short life touched many, and her legacy endures through her father's unwavering resolve. For Gary, the fight continues not just for justice, but for a world where children are safe, loved, and protected. Stevie's memory is a beacon of light, reminding us of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and accountability. Her story is not just a tragedy but a call to action, urging us to do better for the most vulnerable among us.